like you to press record, and then perfect, Mohammed, it's over to you.
Thank you. In the spirit of friendship and solidarity, we, the National Educational Association for Disabled Students, wish to respectfully acknowledge the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis, who are the traditional stewards of this land we know as Canada. At present, I'm speaking from Winnipeg, Manitoba, on the ancestral land, Treaty 1 territory, the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene people, and the homeland of the Métis people. We extend our deepest respect for their enduring presence and profound stewardship of this land. As we assemble for our national event today, we wish to highlight the intersectionality of Indigenous and disability identities. We honor the unique perspectives, contributions, and resilience of Indigenous people and individuals with disabilities, acknowledging the systemic barriers that have historically been and continue to be confronted by these communities. We stand committed to learning from, understanding, and respecting the rich histories, wisdom, and diversity that these communities contribute to our society as we strive towards a more inclusive and equitable future. We pledge to continuously honor these lands and their complex history. As a national organization, we must be committed to truth and reconciliation. We're called upon to educate ourselves about the Indigenous history of our regions and to honor the Indigenous people who live here. Additionally, we are encouraged to engage in an open and thoughtful dialogue about disability, inclusivity, and accessibility, with the aim of fostering a more empathetic and inclusive society for all. Today, as we recognize the past and learn from it, we jointly work towards crafting a better future, one where we respect and validate the myriads of experience within the disability community, continually honoring the traditional custodians of these lands.
Thank you, Mohammed. And I will now invite Lisa to share her screen, and we'll get started.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Delighted to join NEADS here today. Thank you for inviting me to co-share this presentation on disclosure and accommodations. I guess I'll just say a few words about myself, Elizabeth, and then maybe you jump on. I've got your picture on the screen. So
yeah, I love that.
Okay, so my name is Lisa Kelly and I work at the Ontario Chamber of Commerce on various DEI initiatives, specifically the Discoverability Network, which really seeks to encourage employers and support employers to hire and retain people with disabilities in the workplace. So I have a background working with employers, also working with job seekers with a disability, and I have lived experience over 45 years of disability myself. Elizabeth.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, everyone. My name is Elizabeth Mohler. My pronouns are she, her, elle, and today I'm wearing a purple top with a necklace, earrings. I have sort of just below the chin length hair, blonde hair. I am a doctoral candidate at Western University, and I'm also a research consultant here at NEADS. I've been with the organization about 10 years, and I too have experiential knowledge of disability, both personally, so sort of lived and living experience, as well as academically. And I'm really looking forward to being here today with you to share a little bit about both, my experience, but also some tips and tricks on disclosing.
Yeah, and just for full disclosure here, I'm my pronouns are she, her, and I am a older gray-haired woman who smiles a lot and really enjoys working with Elizabeth. We've done these presentations in the past. Okay, so let's dive in. So I thought today, Elizabeth, we could touch on different things. You add in if I'm missing anything. Sure. I thought we just talk about disclosure. I mean, I don't know, what questions you usually get around this, but particularly in my background as an employment counselor, helping people with disabilities to find work, it's like, what is it and what isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And I think also it's interesting to touch on disclosure and how it might differ between school and workplace, because there's definitely some similarities, but a few differences as well.
And I actually think, and that's one of the things we have on this disclosure today, is making that decision. And then, how do we figure out whether or not to, because there may be times I've disclosed to some businesses and then I have absolutely not disclosed to others.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the when and the where too is something that'll be really important to get into, and the timing.
Yeah, exactly. So we'll go through all of that. We'll talk about what you need to do, what the employer needs to do, and then just some tips from my experience on how to disclose. I think from Elizabeth's experience, they're quite different because I have an invisible disability. Elizabeth has a visible disability, so that can affect disclosure as well. And then we'll talk about accommodations, because I think you can't talk about disclosure without talking about accommodations, which is the #1 reason why people typically disclose.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll kind of share with you some tips and tricks too around how to ask for accommodations and what accommodations are and what they are not. It's really important to understand that when we're thinking about asking for these things.
Exactly. And sometimes people may need an accommodation and you may not even know you need an accommodation. So we'll talk about that as well. Have you ever disclosed? I mean, obviously you have, Elizabeth. So do you want to share a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So Lisa brought forward some important terms. The fact that some people have invisible, so you can't see it. Disability, some people call it non-apparent. And some people have a visible disability, which means you can see it or apparent. I have a visual disability. So what that means is you can tell that I'm blind. I use a white cane. You can tell by looking at my eyes, and I only bring that up because that actually discloses for me. So I might be able to not disclose if I'm on the telephone with you or on a Zoom call, but if you were to see me in person, my disability would disclose for me. So I have a lot of experience disclosing both in the academic sphere and in the employment sphere. My personal sort of philosophy for me around disclosing is to make it a part of my brand. And what I mean by that is to use my disability and the things that my disability allows me to do and to be as an asset. So on my website, I talk about my experiential knowledge with disability. And what I mean by that is the knowledge that I've gained through my academic studies, through my living work as a disabled person and a disabled family member that cares for disabled family members, and as well my work in the community and my knowledge that's continuing to grow. And so if you were to Google me, you'd see pretty much right off the hop that I have a disability, and that's a personal choice. It's not one everyone needs to make or should make, but for me, that's worked because it clears the air before I'm potentially talking to somebody if they've Googled me. And it also leaves me in the driver's seat of disclosing in a positive way. What about you, Lisa?
Ooh, Elizabeth, tricky question. So I spent the majority of my early working years and definitely my academic years not disclosing. So I'm able to mask and mask quite easily. A lot of the differences that I have or the challenges that I encounter, I can, kind of make an excuse for, or just say this was a bad week, or stay home sick. Or so for a lot of my career, I did that. I chose to start disclosing around the age of 50. And the reason is that as I aged, my disability changed and my needs changed. And frankly, it's felt like a huge relief. I'm able to get some accommodations I didn't even know I needed. It was very emotional. I really disclosed inappropriately the first time I did it to a large room of people who probably didn't need to know, but it just kind of came out. And since then, I think I've gotten better at it and more comfortable with it. So that might be some of your experiences. The big thing is it's a personal choice. It's not the
Absolutely.
law. You don't have to do it. So many things affecting it. The only times you do, or if it affects your health and safety or others' health and safety, or if you can't do the job because of your disability, in which case you probably shouldn't be applying. How do you feel that works then in the academic setting, Elizabeth, where disclosure might be needed?
Yeah, it's so true. I think for sure disclosure is a very personal choice. And I think it's situation specific, and it's I want to say it's almost fluid. So I've taken courses during the pandemic that were all online, and there was no need for me to disclose everything. The course director really built the course to be accessible. Now, because of the nature of the course, and it was participation based, and because my research is informed by my disability, I did talk about it in the course, but in that case, I probably didn't need to unless I wanted to, because it was the course was really built with accessibility in mind, which is a really beautiful thing. But then there are times I think in the academic space where it's helpful to disclose to the right people the right information to help us get accommodation. So whether that's extra time, or whether that's a note taker or a tutor. It could even be something as simple as a quiet place to write an exam, or for me, a computer with special software or an oral exam, done with myself and a faculty member. I think those are times where, it can be helpful to disclose, but I also think, thinking about when and where and to whom you disclose, especially in academia, is really important. We know that ableism is as prevalent in academia as it is anywhere. And so, yeah, I think what you're saying really resonates with me. I just thinking about, is this right for me, and is the timing right? And do people need to know? And is it relevant to this conversation?
And you have to think ahead a bit. I'm going to speak now as I've taught a couple of university courses or college courses, and people disclosed far down the path, actually, when the course was over. And in some cases, we're not able to get the accommodations or that we need because we waited too long. So that might be something you really want to consider. Academic settings are pretty open, and my experience has been dealt pretty well with the whole experience, and it's a great way to practice. So that's just some thoughts from somebody who was an instructor on a couple courses.
Great perspectives.
So I think that disclosure, as you said, I think it's really situation or context dependent, and it can affect a whole bunch of the job search tools we use. I work in employment a lot, so I've tossed up this slide. It really affects, I love how you said you built it into your brand, Elizabeth. It's part of my brand now as well. So, even if I didn't disclose to an employer, they'd go on on LinkedIn and see all over the place how much I deal with this. So it's part of an asset-based approach, like you said, talking, building on how that's an advantage. It can appear on our resume, cover letter. What do our references say about us? Are they going to mention it if we haven't briefed them? I've had that happen where, we go through the interview, someone doesn't disclose, and then the reference tells me. So, which isn't actually legal, but can happen, not, intentionally, but just sometimes an unintentional disclosure.
Yeah,
so
that's a
we
really
really
good
need to
point.
think about that. We need to think about disclosing, perhaps if it helps us deal with gaps.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, the references and the gaps are both really good points. And I think even in the academic space, if someone's writing you a reference letter, and I remember this happened to me, I was applying for a fairly major scholarship through the Tri-Council. Some of you might know it. It's a Social Science, Humanities, and Research Council. And one of my references wrote a letter, and she talked about it in a very positive way, but she talked about how I've navigated campus and removed barriers and done a lot of advocacy work, but she mentioned my disability. Now, in this case, I reviewed the letter before she sent it. She asked me if I'd like to review it, and I said that would be great. And I did point out, I said, this is fantastic, and I appreciate the positive spin, but just always check with students prior to sharing this kind of information in a letter, even if it is very well written and positive. Because unfortunately, again, we know that there's bias out there, right? And so a potential reviewer might go, well, is this?
And it's our information to share to choose, not somebody that we know. So you need to brief your references. And even when you're networking in interviews, informational interviews, or choosing a mentor. And Elizabeth, you were the one who talked about mentors with and without disabilities. Do you want to mention why that's important?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, sometimes in our field, it's really hard to find a mentor with a disability. So I call them, field specific or career specific, and then somebody with a disability who may or may not be in your career. Sometimes there's just things that, as much as our mentors want to help us, if they're in our career and they don't have a disability, they might not have insight. So it's really nice to have both kinds of mentors. So, for example, how do I network at a conference when I have a disability? Well, likely somebody else with a disability who's had that barrier can chat with me a bit about that. So I think both kinds are important. We need both. And it's important to think through what you want in that mentor with and without a disability.
It's a whole other workshop. And you also were the one who mentioned on social media unintentionally disclosing. So I'm going to let you cover that as well.
Yeah, for sure. So sometimes if we are involved in a lot of advocacy work as a person with a disability, we might be in posts that involve accessibility. So somebody, a potential employer reading might go, oh, I wonder if Elizabeth has a disability. She's really involved in NEADS, and she talks about disclosing a disability. So it's important that you know what you're posting, but that also you know what you're being tagged in. So if people are tagging you, just checking, and maybe again, it's part of your brand and you don't mind, but if you're somebody that's maybe still navigating the when and the where and the how, just really reflecting on how does my social media look?
Yeah, and I think even what we say about the companies we interview with, perhaps we got somebody who did display bias and it's hurtful and angering, but the process might be to then report that, within the company so they have the chance to address that. If we go social media, the odds are that that company's not going to ever give us a chance or have the opportunity to self-correct. And again, think about what other companies are going to think if they see you out there being quite perhaps overly negative or unprofessional in the way you're communicating. They're probably not going to want to consider you for an opportunity. So absolutely, we want to share the, for instance, I know David Leposki has the AODA fails. That's great, but also remember that other companies are going to be looking at that, and that can affect our job search.
Yeah.
Quickly mention discoverability. You do disclose on it, but that's not shared. It's kept private, which is why it's a search engine that is built for people with disabilities to connect to companies who are looking. But of course, are we going to disclose during the job search on company websites, job fairs, that sort of thing? So all those are reasons why disclosure is important. So let's go through what disclosure actually is and what it isn't. So disclosure is when you tell someone you have a disability or health condition. That's it. You can use your own words. There's no particular words. It's like, hi, I'm Lisa Kelly. I have a disability. Okay. Sometimes, and oftentimes, the reason most people disclose is they ask for changes that they need in the workplace or for an interview to do the primary parts of the job or the interview. Those changes are called accommodations. But they don't have to be part of disclosure. So you could simply say, I have a disability. You don't have to share what it is. You don't have to share your medical details. You don't have to prove it. Elizabeth, what is disclosure not?
It's not sharing personal details about a diagnosis or a medical condition. It's not getting into really sort of complex aspects of your disability that aren't related to work. So it's really focused on, that you have a disability and that you need those changes. You don't want to make people feel uncomfortable. And sometimes, unfortunately, that can happen if we're oversharing things that might be sensitive to ourselves or to others.
Yeah, and you just think about this, that I've had people overshare, and
Yes.
it's really uncomfortable. Even
It
when you're
is.
comfortable with disability, it can be really, you start thinking, is this person, why are they telling me this? So
Yeah.
again, it's not particularly helpful to say, oh, I had problems with this, or this is my, that's not part of the interview. It's not part of the job. So we want to stay professional in all our communications and, just stick to, I have a disability, I require this accommodation, or I have a disability, I don't require any accommodations at this time, but I may in future if things change. People with disabilities generally are unwilling to disclose. In fact, 60% of people in this great report, it's older now, 2014, but said that they don't want to disclose anything related to a disability. And for me, that's problematic. I work with employers, and if employers don't know what you need in order to do the job, or do a better job, or do the best job possible, then you're playing at a disadvantage. The company doesn't get the best you, and you don't get what you need to succeed. Now, I know that there's negatives. Okay, I know that all of us have had experiences when we've disclosed and we didn't get a job, or we felt maybe we didn't move on in the interview process. That may or may not be due to the fact that we have a disability. It might be how we shared it. It might be there was just a better candidate. It might be that we were asking too much money and it just never got to that. You don't know. So one of the things I encourage job seekers is don't automatically assume that your disclosure led to not getting the interview, not getting the job, not getting a promotion. Okay, there could be other things going on, so you can ask about that. The other thing is, I think if you follow some of the tips that we're going to give you, including looking for employers that are inclusive. Elizabeth, do you have any ways of telling whether a potential employer is even open to this topic?
Yeah, for sure.
They should be. It's legal, by the way, but some aren't.
So sometimes looking at the job posting, to see if there's language around, we welcome candidates from diverse backgrounds, we welcome accommodations at any stage of the process. So that kind of language tells me they're open. What kinds of things are they posting on LinkedIn? So for example, I do some work with another great organization called Accessible Media Incorporated, and they're very public about posting that they want to give opportunities, apprentice opportunities, to students and those interested in broadcasting who have disabilities. And in fact, in the job posting, they say that having a disability is an asset. So that tells me, oh, okay. Things like this, what types of events are organizations hosting? So if I'm Googling an organization like NEADS and I see this kind of workshop pop up, I'd go, oh, that's a place I might look at. So it's kind of the company culture, and you can find out a lot about that just through your LinkedIn searching, also looking at some of the bios of folks that work there, how diverse is that sort of talent pool. So those are some ways that I sort of use to gauge whether a company may or may not be open.
Yeah, I look at the imagery.
Oh, good one.
I can see, so I look at the images. Do we see people, diverse individuals, including people with disabilities? Do they ask me multiple times? So a lot of job seekers that I've worked with assume that if they ask you, it's because they're trying to weed you out of the process. The exact opposite is true. Most companies post that because they're trying to show that they're open and they want to hire candidates. I agree with you on the bios. You can look and, check Glassdoor ratings. There's lots of different ways, but actually seeking employers that are open to this is better for everyone. Ideally, everybody would be 100% accessible, but I think we're still struggling with that. So providing an accommodation in particular requires the employer knows that you need one. They need to know what the barrier or issue is. They don't need to know your disability. But for me, in the job that I have now, it quickly became apparent to me when I joined the chamber that I was going to require more work at home time than what their policies allowed. And, the noise is just, it's not that bad, I guess, if you're, for some people, but for me, I found it quite overwhelming. And in fact, it caused me to have mood swings, lack of concentration. It just really was very, very difficult to do the job. So, we went through a series of discussions. So noise canceling headsets, move my desk, book off a private office. But eventually I did get the work from home accommodations because that was what was needed to be able to excel. But without me telling them, they would never have known, and I might have worked less productively. So you're the only person that can tell the employer there's an issue. They can't guess. They can try to guess. They might say, hey, Lisa, is something bothering you? But that's a guess. So while you're not legally obligated to disclose, unless it's, again, related to health or safety or the ability to do the job, it's in your interests and the company's interests that you be able to excel. So that might mean telling people what you need. I think, Elizabeth, you had a really good example of an accommodation you didn't even think that you'd need because you had floating desks in an organization.
Yeah, for sure. So when I worked at an organization prior to the pandemic, they had floating or remote desks or like hoteling. So you would just come in, you'd pop yourself down at a desk and you'd plug in. But the challenge was a safety one. Like if I didn't know sort of where people were or where the exit was, because I was always at a new desk and having to get oriented, that's a safety and fire concern, right? If you don't have good orientation, and it was a big open space. So I asked for a desk near the door that was consistent that I could go to every day. But I also took it a step further and asked that my team lead kind of check in the morning, A, to let me know if she was in the office, or B, to let me know where in the office she was, because again, you have to always think emergency, right? We don't want to, but it's important for safety. Some other accommodations that I've asked for that actually benefited everybody are materials being sent in advance of a meeting. So sometimes I've worked for organizations where they'll hand out an agenda at the meeting, and that's the start of the meeting, and then people aren't focused because they're thinking about what they want to add to the agenda or what they want to share. But if you're sending things out in advance, everybody comes more prepared, and then we're actually focused on the speaker, which is always nice for the person speaking. Certainly things like accessible PowerPoints. So, when I'm doing work, making sure that I deliver an accessible presentation, but also that if I'm getting one, that it's accessible. I also use a screen reader. So that's another accommodation that I use.
A funny story, Elizabeth once sent me a note. We were doing a presentation. He said, can I have the version of the PowerPoint that lets me know what pictures on the screen, which was really funny because I hadn't used my alt text. So, that's a great reminder. I work in this space. I generally have accessible documents, but sometimes we might drop something. So it's, that's an accommodation. You might not think of it, but it's necessary. And thank you again for reminding me of that, Elizabeth. Are you disclosing if and when you mean to? So sometimes we unintentionally disclose. Elizabeth, you touched on this. The whole idea of social media, what we're sharing, what we're saying. Maybe we're saying, oh, I have a disability and this company gave me an awful interview. Okay. That means that anybody that looks at your feed, and employers do look at our social media, will be able to read that. So even if you've chosen not to disclose at the interview, if they've read that, they're going to be aware of that. So you just want to keep that in mind. That's for anything, not just disability. Anything you say. Social media, I've become a lot more careful on my interactions. If you do, though, approach, I'd say taking a consistent approach and talk as much about your abilities. So Elizabeth, you talked about this being an asset-based approach. You've built it in as a good thing. And I think that's important because what I do tend to find is sometimes, particularly when we're first disclosing or we have an acquired disability, we talk more about the disability than we do about what we're able to do.
Yeah, it's a really good point, and it's an important point. Sometimes when I'm coaching people, one of the things I'll say is your disabilities are a really important part of you and your identity. But it's not the only part of you and your identity. So sometimes people will introduce themselves to me and they'll say, hi, I'm Elizabeth. I'm blind. And that probably isn't the first thing you want to lead with. You might lead with a couple of other facts and say, oh, and I happen to have a disability. And here are some of the things that I do around sort of adapted sports or whatever your passion projects are. But I think it's just important to think about how you're leading as well.
It's so true. So to disclose or not to disclose. So I want to again stress, and I think Elizabeth and I are on the same page of this. It's a personal decision. It's your choice. The absence of disclosure is not concealment. Okay, so you are not hiding anything. That's your decision to share that, whether you may or may not feel comfortable. So if you have an employer or a peer who says, well, you should have told me, it's like, no, that's absolutely not true. You're not concealing anything. You're just choosing to keep private issues private, which is everybody's right. There's so many reasons why we might disclose or not disclose. So you think about the self-focused. So maybe you see this as part of your identity. So definitely for me, that's one of the reasons I disclose now. Your health condition has changed or what it is. Maybe you have a stigmatized disability that can make it really challenging to disclose or uncomfortable. The status of the condition, has it changed? And again, whether it makes you feel authentic or not. If you do, again, add it as just one of the many parts of your identity because we are composed of more than just, one diverse element. What are some of the other focused reasons, Elizabeth, that people might disclose or choose not to?
Yeah, I think thinking about, the environment of the workplace, is it somewhere that you need to disclose? So like I gave the example of the hoteling desks, like that was a really, really important kind of consideration for me. I think another reason that people may or may not choose to disclose is, like I said, is it relevant to what you're doing? Like for me, I use the example of the online course. It wasn't relevant. It came out over time, but it wasn't necessary at the time.
I've lived in different countries and the norms are different. So that could affect it. Where you're living, small town, urban center, rural center, country that you're in, cultural norms, stigma, like I mentioned before. Sometimes just to explain and educate. I've done that before. People use terminology and I say, I just happen to belong to that group. I don't feel comfortable with the language and here's why. Can you change it? Here's why I have to book a private office sometimes. Experiential reasoning. So again, most of us will have had a past experience where we've disclosed and it's been negative, and that's unfortunate. And I really feel for anyone who's been through that. But we shouldn't assume future experiences will be as negative as, we have experienced in the past, or things will never change. Sometimes we can see others disclose and that affects us. You are, whether you disclose or not, you have a right to that information being kept confidential within the organization, but also our job role, the industry, again, that context that Elizabeth, or situation that Elizabeth talked about are all really, really important reasons why we do or don't. The number one, you'll see that I've got factors up here that influence disclosure. And the number one, which is why it appears in bright blue on the upper left-hand portion of the screen, is accommodations. Most people disclose because they need a change in the environment. All right, but again, and I think another one that really, really affects is our manager, which is appears directly below that. Elizabeth, have you ever been hesitant to disclose because you feel the company's okay, but your manager's not?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is tricky because sometimes I know for myself, I try to kind of look for companies that are quote unquote inclusive. And then, I get through the door and I'm like, the company's great, but I'm just finding that there's a little bit of clash with the manager, or there's a concern about, I worry that if I'll disclose, there'll be concerns about my abilities, my capabilities, or that it'll be more quote unquote work, that I'll ask for an accommodation that will be more work or more money, and how that will be perceived.
Yeah, I actually worked for a disability organization and I never disclosed that I had a disability because my manager, I felt, just wasn't going to get it, because the focus of the organization was not my disability. And I'm not even sure that the organization viewed my particular disability as a disability. So it was too uncomfortable, and I actually ended up leaving. So, lots of factors that affect that, unfortunately. Gender, age, geography, intersectionality, again, all of these may affect. There's so many, we don't have time. We could do a workshop just on these factors, but there's lots of different reasons. Sometimes we have to disclose because it's called forced disclosure, because maybe we're having more frequent flare-ups. If we have a chronic condition or an episodic condition, maybe we need a sick leave or hospitalization. So, age, as we age. And oftentimes, in my experience, youth with disabilities, there's more confusion around disclosure and the logistics of it. So younger people, and maybe they're starting out in their career, have more concerns about disclosing than those of us that are older. So again, lots and lots of disclosure. There's also different types of disclosure. And I'm saying this concealment here, but in the terms of it actually being a strategy, not in that you're hiding something from the employee. So I guess, Elizabeth, yours is a full voluntary disclosure?
Yeah, I would say it's interesting. I think it's voluntary, but I also think it's sort of it's apparent as soon as I enter a room. So my disability sort of discloses for me if I'm walking in with a white cane, or
forced disclosure then.
Yeah,
it's a forced disclosure.
Yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, full voluntary disclosure. I guess that's what I'm doing with my current company, is when I talk about my health condition at work to everyone. And I've done that because I feel like it's a respected environment. There's mutual understanding. The power balance won't change. So for me, I'm at the point where it's usually full voluntary. But there can be selective disclosure where you control how much information, and to a limited number of people. And the very first time I disclosed at my company, I used selective disclosure with my manager only. Eventually, because the accommodations were driving other people crazy, like the private office, I decided, okay, I'm going to go full voluntary so people understand that I'm not hogging offices, that I actually need it because of my disability. Forced disclosure is when you don't have a choice. Maybe it's a visible disability. Sometimes there's imbalance, a power imbalance there. And finally, there's concealment strategies. So maybe those are tactics. Remember, I said I could mask. Masking is a concealment strategy. or selective sharing. So ideally, we want to be in that full voluntary disclosure because we work in a great organization, but all of these are legitimate strategies. Don't feel bad if you use one or, you change your strategy. It's up to you in the circumstances. Elizabeth, I'm going to let you tackle the what, when, and who to disclose. So just the logistics of it. What do we
Yeah.
disclose?
So you're kind of thinking the what, right? So,
Yep.
what do I disclose? So kind of thinking about, again, you're thinking about needed for accommodation, talking about the fact you have a disability. So thinking about timing, I always like to think of like place and space and time. So you want to have a quiet space. You want to make sure it's with somebody that is your manager or somebody that you trust. You want to think about what you're saying. So kind of the how you're disclosing. And you don't want to sort of be defensive when you're talking about it. So you want to make sure that you've practiced, that you feel calm, that you're using words that are not sort of medical jargony. So yeah, I like to think of it as kind of time, place, and space. So picking a time when the other person's not in a rush, booking a specific meeting to talk about it, and then having points, if it helps, written down that you can refer to help you stay on track.
And I sometimes remind people who you disclose to is really
Yeah,
important. So
absolutely.
you should be disclosing to the person that can get you address the barriers and remove them or provide you with the accommodation. And generally that's in a small business, the employer, in a mid-sized to larger, that might be the manager, sometimes the recruiter if we're interviewing, or human resources. Colleagues generally, they can help you get accommodations. So unless you want to go that full disclosure that we talked about earlier, probably best strategy is to start with whoever can get you what you need in order to do the job. And, I think the how, Elizabeth, you touched on that. It's really important. The only thing I'd add is it's a discussion.
Yeah.
So you do have a right to an accommodation. You have a legal right, but the employer has the legal right to select what that accommodation is. So you may not get immediately, what you asked for. So again, I go back to when I disclosed about the noise, I got the noise canceling headsets and they really do work. I love them, but they don't always work. So then I had to go back and discuss again. And so then it was headset and new area for my desk. And then I had to go back again and say, okay, office. And then when other people started commenting on how often it was becoming a bit of an issue, I had to go to okay, I'm going to fully disclose now and I'm going to work from home. I didn't have to. And my employer said, you don't have to. I said, no, it's okay. I actually feel pretty comfortable. So it's an ongoing discussion. It's not a one and done. And, you can't automatically, my solution was I'd like an office, my own private office. Never got that because the employer gets to choose. Any other comments you want to add to that, Elizabeth?
Yeah, I think, when you're talking about disclosure and thinking about accommodations, the employer may or may not know a lot about your disability. So sometimes in my case, the employer or even in an academic setting, a faculty member said, like, what would work here? I'm not really familiar. And it's a conversation, like you've said, it's dynamic and it's changing back and forth. So sometimes with faculty, I'll say, well, I understand I may not be able to get the materials in advance. I recognize you're prepping lectures sometimes up until the night before, but what about sending it after? So it is important to understand that we're often very familiar with our disabilities. We're often experts in them, but those around us may not be, and we have to be patient. It's hard, but it's really important to sort of remind ourselves of that.
Yeah, and I think even I remember the first times we started working together, and sometimes I'd hear companies go, oh, but we don't have Braille for Elizabeth. And it's like, well, but she has a screen reader. So actually it's not a big deal. And they just may not be aware of the tech or the other options that are out there. People jump to assumptions about what they know about something or, and aren't aware of what they don't know. So patience is a really good attribute. There are a lot of risks to disclosing. Unconscious bias, a stigma, fear that your accommodation may be denied. On the other hand, if you never ask for one, it's, you're not going to get one anyway. Fear of negative consequences. You may be treated differently or that your information will not stay confidential. And in that instance, you can actually ask the employer how they're going to keep your information confidential. Elizabeth, what are the benefits though of disclosing?
Yeah. Accommodations really allow us to do our job and be our best. Another colleague of mine, also named Elizabeth, used to talk about bringing your full authentic self to work. And I love that, because if you're feeling like you have to mask or hide or prove, and you're sort of working to work because you haven't disclosed, that can be really stressful, and ultimately it can impact your work. And so, yeah, you don't want to make do, right? You want to feel valued, and you want to feel that positive job satisfaction. And sometimes disclosing can help us do that. And companies can plan appropriate resources and support. So I talked earlier about meeting materials being sent in advance. That helps everybody, but then the company knows and they can plan for that. And that can just be built into the protocol of when you schedule a meeting, do X. So those are the things that I think about in terms of the positives.
Yeah, also you disclosing can really contribute to the workplace environment. That definitely happened with me. We ended up bringing on the program that I worked on, 90% of the people that worked on it had a disability, because it was like, oh, this is actually working out well. It educated everybody. Other people came forward, started sharing their experiences, their needs. It just made for a much better, more productive, and better workplace cultures. So, and there's data that supports that, that shows that. Some strategies, you talked about this, Elizabeth. The privacy piece is really important, and that you have enough time. You don't want to be doing this in the hallway.
No, and I would actually agree that this is really important. And I would say the same for those of us who are sort of student learners still. Don't go up, well, I shouldn't say don't. It's been my experience that going up to a professor when they're harried before or after class and having this conversation is probably not going to get the best results. Schedule that time during an office hour, and make sure there's enough time. So sometimes I'll just ask for a little bit of extra time, because students can sometimes be waiting in the hall. It's a private discussion. It's a little bit different in post-secondary, because you're actually talking more about your accommodations, disclosure. Yeah, but
it's still the same. And I actually disclosed to my boss when I first joined. I said, I have a disability. I don't require an accommodation. And that was the end of that. And I'm so glad that I did that, because, a week into the job, I suddenly needed the noise accommodations. So it can be very beneficial. Be mindful of your body language and your tone. You said that, don't be defensive, but also don't be aggressive, right?
for sure.
It's a tough topic for both people, the person sharing and the person listening, if they're not comfortable with the topic. Focus on the barriers, review options. You can always say, well, I'm not sure, let's meet back at, but set times and dates as well as next steps. And I really encourage everyone to get it written down. That way there's no confusion about what you're getting and what the employer and you have agreed to. I put in this accommodation decision tree. This is by Barbara Roberts from 2006. I think it's a really good, this is kind of the framework that businesses use when they're deciding whether to provide an accommodation. And I sometimes think seeing it from the other perspective, in this case, the employers, can be helpful. So you can see that for some questions, if it's a no, the whole discussion just stops. So what you want to be thinking about is moving it into the yes. So is there a disability? Well, you have to say yes. If you say no, they're not, expected then to provide you with the accommodation. They don't have to make, let's say you were suddenly late and you come back and say, okay, now I have a disability. That doesn't mean that they have to listen to that. You decided the minute you say no, it falls into other categories, performance instead of disability. So be aware of that. The second thing is, if yes, there is a disability, you move down to, is there a barrier for you participating? So maybe it's a lack of something, or it's a change needed. And if it's yes, it gets sent down to, now we're going to provide you with accommodation. Is it appropriate? And the employer is probably going to start as simply as they can. That makes sense. They want to get things, moving along. And if it, yes, you can come back and address that, whether it continues to be appropriate. And then, and that's why the step between is it appropriate and our essential requirements maintained is the discussion part. That's where you may have to talk about, this is I'm not getting my essentials, right? And then the decision is made, to offer the accommodation. So how do you know if you need an accommodation, Elizabeth?
Yeah, there's definitely a couple of facts. You can ask yourself, what is the barrier or, the challenge that I'm having. So, for me, I can't read print, so the barrier would be that. What's worked in the past? So then thinking about, okay, maybe I need auditory format or braille, or maybe I need text to speech or speech to text. What conditions do I work best in? So Lisa's talked a lot about working in quiet. I like that too. It's not a matter of like, I shouldn't say that. It works better for me because I'm listening to a screen reader as well. Know what you need. And this is hard, and we can certainly touch on some things to help you know what you need. But if you can come in with the toolbox or the arsenal of tools to say, in the past, it's worked well when I've had a quiet space to work, a headset, and frequent breaks, then employers are able to sort of help you sort of manage what that looks like.
Yeah, and there's a really good website. It's American, but it's excellent. The Job Accommodation Network, and it has the acronym SOAR, and it stands for Searchable Online Accommodation Resource. And you can go search by accommodations, by disability type, by work environment, and you can get some ideas. So I find that's an excellent resource. In terms of what you can ask for, you can ask for disability confidence training or awareness training or anti-bias training, whatever you want to call it, but maybe people in your office are not aware and not treating you appropriately. So usually that's the biggest barrier. Changes to the way we communicate. Elizabeth, you said auditory format, ASL, the language, but it might even be, I need someone to repeat things. I need it written down. I need someone to speak more slowly.
A tough one for those who speak quickly like me.
Me too, you and I both. Providing adaptive or assistive devices, changes to the work environment or spaces, and that could be, I just need a washroom closer, or I need a desk closer to a washroom, or the door, as Elizabeth pointed out. And sometimes to processes. So you can ask for changes to interview process. You can ask for changes to workflow processes, right? So that it can help you do the job. When we disclose, simple 3 steps. State that you have the disability. If you require an accommodation, tell people how to let you do the job or what the barrier or challenge is. And then 3, just have this discussion on realistic alternatives. So I'm Lisa Kelly, I have a disability. I find working in an open concept environment quite challenging. Would it be possible for me to have noise canceling headsets, as that will reduce the noise interaction? And then that's as simple as it has to be. Elizabeth, do you want to give an example of you disclosing?
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, I'm Elizabeth Mohler. I have a visual disability. I will require things sent electronically to me so that I'm able to participate in this course or in this meeting.
Perfect. Yeah. So we've given you some examples here. One that comes up often with youth learning disabilities. And again, I have a disability. This is the asset-based approach now. I learn differently. Not that I can't learn or I'm slow or anything like that. Those negative ideas people have, stereotypes. You just say, I learn differently. So I need an accommodation. In the past, extra time allows me to learn all the material and some one-on-one time with the trainer. I think, and then there's a discussion, and then, the agreement might be an additional week of training. I'm happy to come in early to complete paid training. And again, write that down. So you want to tailor your message. You might disclose to some people, not to others. What's the goal? Are you trying to educate, explain, be your authentic self, get an accommodation? That can affect what you're disclosing. Always, always emphasize strengths and that you can do the job, you just do it differently. And practice. I found, like I said, the first time I disclosed, I was all over the map. I was emotional. I was teary-eyed. I made everybody uncomfortable. So you need to practice because an interview isn't the best place to practice. So practice with someone who'll give you honest feedback so that you strip out the stuff that isn't necessary or that, maybe inappropriate signals, and you're sticking with just the basics of what you need in order to disclose appropriately. We already did strategies. So after you disclose, the employer might ask you for suggestions. They might say, what limitations or restrictions do you have? And this is called functional limitations. And the employer does have the legal right to ask for that. And sometimes they might need to contact your doctor to find out what that is. That might be something like, what are lifting restrictions? How often can this person lift? Is there an upper and lower limit? They're still not entitled to your diagnosis or your medical treatment, but they can ask the doctor for what are those restrictions so that they can give you the appropriate, accommodation. In my experience, a lot of people think they think that the reason they're doing that is to prove you have a disability. It's not. It's simply for the purposes of learning the limits or restrictions. And if they do ask for that information, they pay for it. The employer decides on the accommodation. So we need to have this as be a positive discussion, which we should anyway, right? Elizabeth, how do we know if the accommodation is working?
Regular checkbacks. So checking in with the employer. You kind of, I think sometimes if we don't know, that checkback will happen at performance time, but we want to try and avoid that, right? We want to try and think about having a regular check-in. If the job has changed, rethinking your accommodations, or like during COVID, if the setting of the job has changed, do I still need accommodations? But I think, I would say it's really important to try to have those kind of frequent check-ins. Accommodations, it's a bi-directional conversation. They're fluid, and we want to think about it as kind of a check-in. So that could be during your one-on-ones that you have. It could be something you set up, but I would try to avoid, waiting until there's a performance issue if possible.
What a great way to end. So we'll take questions now. Elizabeth, thank you for asking me to participate. I always enjoy
This is so fun.
webinars with you because you're so great and knowledgeable. So thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, so we'll stop and see if anybody has any questions. So Dr. Margaret Oldfield has raised her hand.
Yes, Margaret.
Margaret, do you want to unmute? And
yep, getting things going here. Thanks very much for a very comprehensive presentation. Disclosure in the workplace is one of my research areas, and I congratulate you on covering a lot more than you should disclose. Here's how to do it, and you'll get an accommodation. You've done a very good job of being telling us the risks and the logistics, and that we need to think about work environments. I should mention that I have an invisible disability, so where I'm coming from in research is invisibility and chronic illnesses that need different kinds of accommodations than physical disabilities do. I wanted to mention one thing that you might think of for your next presentation is universal supports. These are being increasingly talked about in the work disability research field. They move well beyond people with disabilities approaching employers and seeking accommodations, and they take the work off disabled people and address ableism in the workplace by challenging employers and teaching employers through developing disability confidence, how to universally support everybody in their workplace, so that people with invisible disabilities in particular don't have to disclose. And some examples come from our research for the Mental Health Commission of Canada. You can look that up, or I can send it to you if you want. And we found that hardly anyone that we talked to requested a formal accommodation. They either did it informally with a supportive manager, which means you have to have a supportive manager, or they used universal supports. And these examples were prescription drug plans, many kinds of leave that some larger employers have, like mental health leave, personal leave, sick leave that doesn't put you in a situation of being penalized for taking it, family leave, of course, people using the intersectionality concept are also parents often, so they need family leave. It's not just the disability that's a concern. It's that you have to stay with a sick child, for example. So there's all kinds of things that employers can do to provide supports to every employee so that individual employees don't have to do the work to educate the employer. And there's efforts going on to encourage employers to do this by the Mental Health Commission. There's also, for example, different ways of supervising. Again, this comes from our work for the Mental Health Commission. And workplace culture is a biggie, changing workplace culture, which Lisa and Elizabeth both mentioned. And I also wanted to emphasize that disclosure is not just a yes/no choice, and it doesn't just happen at the situation of hiring, which you alluded briefly to. It happens day to day, and this is the research that I've done in my doctoral thesis. I called it disclosure dances, where you had to respond to, how come you're not feeling well today, but you were fine yesterday? Or somebody forgetting that you have a disability, even that's invisible, even though you disclosed it. You have to remind them. Other things like dealing with fluctuations. Often you have to think of something on the spot that may disclose your disability, or it may not, if that's your choice. So I can send you information on that too.
So thank you so much.
That I wanted to bring up as some additional things that you might think about.
So thank you very much for raising those. We actually do a workshop for employers that deals much more with some of the things you're talking about. But as we're talking with people personally with disclosing, obviously they don't have control over what an employer might or might not embrace in terms of philosophy, universal design, or iterative processes to improve the workplace. So yeah, we definitely do cover that traditionally, just not in an hour on this, but I do really would love any information that you have. You raised some really excellent points and something for everybody to remember. And yes, you can disclose at any time. It may be like years into your employment. So thank you for raising that too. It's a really important point.
Yeah.
You have a comment and a question in the chat from Kim. Can you please review what essential requirements?
Yeah, we did. I put some things in the chat there around Barbara Roberts' work, and Lisa actually gave a really wonderful example.
So just for everybody, just in case you haven't, essential requirements are the absolute things somebody needs to do a job. So as an employment counselor, you do need to be able to meet with clients, maybe do assessments, write resumes, do mock interviews. Those aren't, you're never going to get a job as an employment counselor if you cannot do any of those. All right. But it may be that you're expected to make coffee, unload boxes of paper for the photocopy machine, shovel the walks out in the front. That happened to me. Those are not essential requirements. And so you can, as long as you can do the main parts of the job, the parts of the job that actually make the job, you don't have to worry about non-essential requirements. So that's where there can be some flexibility on that. And even when we think about some jobs, being able to deliver a webinar virtually could be something. I'm still doing the job delivering a webinar, but I'm doing it virtually instead of in person. So again, meeting the primary or essential requirements, which is delivering content to people, just the way we do it may change. So you really have to be looking at those, and when you're asking, make sure you can do the main parts of the job. Employers are notoriously bad at listing primary or essential requirements. They often list everything under the sun in their job ads. So you just want to make sure you can do the primary functions of the job. If you look at NOC codes, the National Occupation Classification Codes, they'll list what are the primary, parts of most jobs in Canada. And as long as you can do those, you're good to go.
Thanks, Anne. Yeah, lots of comments in the chat, just appreciating. And we can certainly send, there'll be a YouTube available. You'll get an email in your inbox with that link. We can certainly make arrangements to send, the PDF out if that's helpful. And yes, Sam, I think we'll take one last question from Sam.
Hi,
be mindful of time.
can you hear me?
Yes,
Yeah.
we can.
Thank you so much for this presentation. It was really helpful, especially as a finishing undergrad student going into higher academias or the workplace. I don't really know. But I was wondering if you had any advice on when to bring up disclosure and or accommodations during the interview process. Like what point of the interview do you say, oh, by the way, I have a disability, you know? So yeah, that was my question. Thank you so much.
Well, there's no right or wrong. It's up to you. Different people have different strategies of it. So for me, I think as early as possible, because I think if you need questions in advance, for instance, to really do your best in an interview, ask for it, because if not, you're going to just make do, and you might not have as good an interview as somebody else who doesn't need that accommodation. So I ask for interview questions prior to, even if it's 10 minutes, it just helps me sort things, because I understand better by reading than the auditory processing. So, you know, that's one way to think of it. For some people, prefer not to ask until they get the job offer and it's written down. So you could, though, try, you could, you know, wait and see. My worry as an employment counselor would always be, are we putting ourselves at a disadvantage? And just having an okay interview or the okay start to a job, because we're masking, we're making do. And you want to be able to excel from the moment you go into that interview room or the moment you get hired. So, but again, up to you, because it might be affected by, wow, this is stigmatized and people aren't going to give me a fair shot, or, you know, or I think that that's what the case is. Elizabeth, what's your feeling on that?
Yeah, I think I would add to everything you said, which is so true. It also depends on the workplace. There's workplaces that I've applied to where I feel safe disclosing, you know, perhaps at that interview stage that I might require an accommodation. If there's anything requiring testing or writing, I'll need to bring my own computer. So I think I would just add that sometimes it can be workplace specific or contextual. And I also think it depends on the job itself and whether you think, you know, based on your own experience, you're going to need an accommodation.
Yeah, I think that, you know, for in terms of legal options, you're more protected once you have a contract or an offer and you've signed it. So I think that's why a lot of people wait till after that point. But again, I think then you disadvantage yourself potentially at an interview, but it's really up to you. And you just kind of have to work through the job, the manager, the process. What's this company like? What is my disability? What, you know, and then balance and weigh them all. Talking to an employment counselor, again, those mentors with and without a disability. So for my field, what it might be the best option, for my disability, what might be the best option, and just kind of, you know, really strategizing about that. It's unfortunate we need to even strategize. I mean, I feel really bad saying some of these things, because it should be, as Dr. Oldfield pointed out, this shouldn't be something that we have to worry about or think about or strategize around, but it is the reality that we probably do.
Well, thank you,
Thank you so
everyone.
much.
I think just in the interest of time and to be mindful of our what we've asked you to commit to and our captioners and ASL interpreters, that we'll end here. Certainly I can speak for myself. You have my email if you registered for this event, and you're more than welcome to get in touch with me and ask any questions. And I will, Lisa's popped hers in the chat. So I will close us there and thank everybody for a wonderful session and wishing everybody a wonderful holiday season.